Alright, so hi guys, my name is Elgard and I am one of the CAPs for NOVED 2023 and I'm here to talk to you about the key answers to MCQ and true and false test breakdown. So for the multiple choice question section, essentially we're gonna talk about both questions here. For what should you do in a room with radically different decisions full of panels with radically different decisions? The answer should be to discuss in chronological order so that you are able to give each team the proper airtime that you need and to allow for each panelist with different radical decisions to explain why they think certain team should win, why they think certain team shouldn't. We understand that if the decision might not be as radical, you don't have to go chronological because you can just decide the closest call. But I think generally it's important to have an understanding and of why certain teams are first, second, third, fourth in all decisions, but especially when you have radically different decisions. Second, which of these options is specific knowledge, right? The answer is the Thai party seeking coalition for Pro Junta party in Thailand. Because if you ask the everyday person on the street, they might know what Donald Trump is up to, they might know what a social movement is, but they might not be able to mention even just one party in Thailand, let alone the political movements inside the country, because it doesn't have the media airtime that other issues might not generally have. So moving on, right, to truth or false section. So for the truth or false section, first question is POI cannot be valued higher than materials presented in a substantive speech. The answer is false. It most definitely can, because we don't judge points based on whether they are labeled as POI or an argument or a rebuttal. It's generally seen as a contribution, and if that contribution does cast a doubt, for example, towards substantive speech that was given, it should definitely be credited as so, or even maybe be a higher point, for example, than maybe a less substantiated speech, for example, when there is no likelihood that it's definitely attacked by the POI. So what I'm trying to say is that just judge the point as is. Don't make the POI label this prevents you from actually judging it holistically. Second, this House supports the abolishment of religion. It is obligated for government team to explain the counterfactual. The answer is false. You're not obligated to explain what would happen if there is no abolishment of religion. You just have to explain why the abolishment of religion is good, therefore we need to support that. Because as government, your burden of proof is why it is worth supporting. That's why it's not true for you to explain, for the government team to explain the counterfactual. Thirdly, DPM did not contribute an extension to the debate, only hard-hitting responses. Even though Uchi won, we penalized DPM speaks due to this reason. Answer is false. DPM, any deputy, does not have obligation to extend, just contribute. Rebuttals is worth as much as extensions, and if certain teams decide to not want to, bring extensions, definitely fine, because a hard-hitting response is worth just as much. Fourth question, right? In the motion of this House prefers a world without the concept of marriage, it is valid and strategic for opposition to defend the inclusive world where all types of marriage are being recognized by the states and general society. It's not a valid strategy, because in this motion, the House prefers a world where without the concept of marriage, posits that opposition should talk about why the concept of marriage is inherently good, not automatically meaning that all marriages will necessarily be recognized by states and general society. You have to defend the status quo of what the marriage looks like in current status quo. So it's not a debate of different factuals, different alternate realities. It's alternate reality given by government versus current reality of status quo. 5. CG's strategy is to be radically oppositional from OG's reasonable setup to avoid being labeled as derivative. This is a valid strategy for CG to win, even if they have to rebut several points established by OG. False. Knifing is never allowed because knifing knifing can only be done on very rare occasions, in which I guess uncharitable, undebatable, but it's very rare and usually doesn't happen. So closings don't rebut your openings. Simplest answer. You can expand, you can point out that they didn't explain this, and that's the most important thing, but you can't negate what they've said. You can only just say that there is a more important point, but don't rebut. 6. The PM just gave a strong extension, however, it is contradictory to what was implied by PM. However, no opposition team pointed this out. You credit the extension as a tipping point for OG. False. I think as EPM, I think as judge, you need to be very aware of contradictions that might happen. In the case of contradiction, you cannot then credit the point, especially if the point was said. You cannot credit the second point that was stated. You must always credit the first point that was stated in the debate. So, no, most definitely you cannot credit credit that extension given by OG because it's contradictory, even when no team pointed out. But if the other team pointed out, then you can credit that as something that harms OG as credited by the other team. 7. In the motion of SDUS, Israel will publicly point out Israel's war crimes. The argument explains why war crimes are horrible, Israel is responsible, Palestinians are massively harmed. The argument does not answer the burden of the motion. The answer is true, and that's because the motion states that as the US XXX, which means that you should explain why this is within the interest of the US, not just why Israel is responsible or why Palestinians are massively harmed. So an actor motion demands an actor's perspective. 8. If a speaker approximately gets 75 in Asian parliamentary, they approximately get 77 in British parliamentary. False, because there's no such thing. You cannot measure based on what they think it will look like in Asian parliamentary. Always use your senses. Refer back to the judge manual, the scoring manual given by us. In room 10, in the room where the chair is outvoted, the chair can still deliver the OA. The answer is true because this is VP and usually the chair will still be part of the discussion, and if the chair feels like they don't have the bias, for example, they're still able to reflect the tipping points agreed upon by the discussion, then the chair can most definitely still deliver that OA. So yeah, that was all for the true or false section. Good luck. Over to you, Hans.
Alright, hi everyone. I'm Hans. I'll be responsible explaining regarding the SI test answer or the breakdown for each of the questions. They're already being given in the judge test. So let's start with the first question. I will not read the question again. I think it's you guys already done it. The first one is basically regarding the motion of obliging minimum quota for gender minority in esports major competition. In short, the question basically asks if Prime Minister argue in terms of the toxicity of the community of esport, hence the quota probably is the way to normalize the existence of gender minority to improve the environment, while leader of opposition argue in terms of allocation of budget that it should be allocated for something else like facility to improve the skills, especially for gender minority, etc. The answer for this one is basically PM won the exchange over leader of opposition. So the reason is basically on two folds. The first one is leader of opposition fails to explain the exclusivity of their mechanism. In this question, providing a minimum quota is not exclusive toward the slots in the tournament, but can extend to other matter as well. This means that things like training, for example, or facility is probably also to some extent is an extension of such minimum quota. This means that LO mechanism can even be considered as half stance within this debate, since providing quota can directly means of providing those facility. This is exclusively for gender minority in the process, especially when the arguments are directed more on providing the facility for gender minority specifically is crucial. This sounds like more of a half stance instead of a clear or bolder stance from opposition, but also it's questioning the exclusivity of such mechanism. Now, to some extent, if Deputy Prime Minister come to the debate and say that the alternative LO provided is something that's inexclusive, then it's fair. But even without DPM or any other teams pointing that out, it should be obvious for judges to take mechanism that inherently either half stance or even to some extent not exclusive is something that should not be counted as a contribution that being claimed exclusively by a certain team. The second thing is also in terms of the goal from both teams. So Prime Minister goal mainly is normalizing the existence of gender minority, while leader of opposition more on gender minority aim to win esport major. There's two things that you can explain in regards of this the answer for this first SI question, which is since both teams are implicitly agree that platform for gender minority is important, PM managed to show a better urgency on getting normalization, i.e. a toxic environment, etc. In comparative to winning major, that being the goal by leader of opposition, it's still unclear and even to some extent not well explained why then winning this kind of major, esport major is something that inherently good or to some extent inherently urgent in comparative to changing the toxic environment that already very massive within this esport community. We do understand Prime Minister probably does not explain well in terms of how normalization can happen, but the urgency alone already beating out opening opposition, or in this case, leader of opposition urgency of winning esport majors, hence making probably LO argument less important in comparative to opening government argument in this particular case because of the missing urgency themselves. But second thing is also the urgency is not being responded well. Portrayal of more training means that gender minority will be good. It's not something that they does not guarantee they'll be accepted in a toxic environment that PM already being set up. So at best, if it is true that leader of opposition managed to explain, or even to some extent opposition managed to explain that training will make you win esport major, it does not negate the urgency already provided by Prime Minister in this particular case, which means existence of harm still exists in opening opposition. The second question is basically regarding tech companies, is basically about breaking up. Opening government argue that it's a fiat that breaking up will be done well, meaning there will be numerous tech companies that will rise and create market competition, while opening opposition try to argue that breaking up will be done well is not something that's within the fiat. Hence, most likely smaller tech companies will most likely collapse because they are too small. Then they will tap into a niche market or something along that line that probably will not increase any competition whatsoever. The answer for this question is basically opening opposition won the exchange in comparative to opening government. There's basically only two reasons. The first one is opening option is true when they argue opening government does not have fiat to assume that breakup will be done well. I think this is accessed in the judge manual as well as the debater manual, that opening government or government bench have the fiat that the policy will be passed, but whether or not the policy will be done well is something that's within the debate. So it's not something that can just be a fiat for government bench. This means opening government cannot just say that the impact will be good. They need to provide the analysis and process what will likely the breakup look like and why it will result into a good breakup rather than something that probably would be pushed by opening opposition. Hence, the impact cannot be solely taken just simply because opening government already mentioned there's fiat. The fiat is not true. They need to explain the process. This means the debate so far, the second thing, relies on who managed to explain the better likelihood on existence of competitions. Since both teams argue that market competition, or to some extent implicitly agree that market competition inherently is something that's good, OG false fiat makes no explanation whatsoever in terms of likelihood. Meanwhile, opening opposition, at least able to prove the likelihood of the result in opening government will not exist, i.e., the things about too small to compete, hence create no competition whatsoever, etc. Even though so far opening option does not have any benefit yet, it already shows and proves that whatever opening government try to do, there's no net benefit whatsoever that you can get in a certain way because of those missing likelihood. So the likelihood that provided by opening option so far is the likelihood that prove any benefit in opening government will not happen and will not true at all. It is probably does not have net positive yet, but it's already enough to make opening option win over opening government, because at the very least the urgency of having the motion being passed is something that's already been gone and not being discussed at all, or there's nothing that left in OG that can make the policy stance. Lastly, the third question. This is quite tricky. I think there's a lot of different opinion on this one, but for the question themselves is mainly about opening government arguing in motion about feminists opposing policies that incentivize people to get married, contextualizing patriarchal context, then elaborating an argument explaining that inside a marriage, most likely it will be an oppression for general women due to numerous factors. Hence, feminists opt to oppose anything that will contribute into either the oppression or even women stuck in a marriage that they don't want to. The continuation is closing government basically contextualizing further in terms of financially incentivized individuals. Policy look like marriage subsidy, state-sponsored program, etc. Hence, explaining the current context of difficult financial condition, so on and so forth, until the point where it creates a coercion. Hence, that coercion violate women's bodily autonomy, and that's violation of bodily autonomy is something the feminists should oppose, because feminists always oppose that, using parallel example of abortion. The answer for this one is opening government won the exchange over closing government. There's three things that you can explain, or we can explain as the answer for this question. The first one is CG's new extension somewhat sound more explicit and relevant, i.e. the things about, more financially incentivized by government, what does it look like, etc. However, opening government contextualization is already enough to show the same outcome of how women are being coerced inside of the marriage. Because the contextualization that being explained by closing government here is something that's connected into how women or even society in general being coerced into marriage is probably having the same outcome as what opening government try to argue. There's two things on this. The first one, opening government context on patriarchal state can still be counted as urgent and relevant, especially since opening government specifically already managed to set up the debate that the debate occurs in patriarchal states. Hence, closing government addition on financial incentivization for context probably is quite questionable. Why is it necessary to eventually increase the coercion part, and even does not weigh more in the debate as well in some way, because of that question of why then contextualization is necessary to prove that coercion will happen when opening government already explained. There's also another factor, and this is an addition toward those type of factors that already coerce women inside of the marriage. But the second thing is that the added context of coercion from closing government doesn't add any persuasion as to why women will be coerced inside of the marriage. And this is, I think, the more crucial part. The first context that closing government explained, the policy looks like marriage subsidy and other types of state program like state-sponsored program, etc. While the societal context that being explained by closing government here is that it's currently is in a difficult financial condition. This means the first context only prove that marriage is something that will be accessible in some way, but it does not prove why then suddenly coercion is something that will happen, because the coercion that being explained in terms of the second context is that people want to have a certain economic benefit because they are currently in difficult financial condition. Hence, these two analyses is something that to some extent are mismatched. Hence, the coercion in closing government is being questionable in this particular case. So what is the conclusion of this part is that opening government proving coercion through other types of context, i.e. patriarchal context, as well as this policy supporting that is something that's quite, to some extent, more direct and more believable in comparative to CG added context. And that's still questionable why then the policy that being explained in form of marriage subsidy or other program that makes marriage accessible is something that will make people coerced to go to marriage if the issue is about difficult financial condition, which the policy probably does not give direct benefit or economic benefit directly toward people. So the coercion is still questionable in closing government. The second and third one, also the last things that I'll explain. The second one, CG added philosophical analysis of using abortion as a parallel example on limiting women freedom of choices or women bodily autonomy. This extends OG principle analysis on why this house should oppose, since this is what will most likely harm women in the process, etc. So basically, opening government in this case already managed to explain in terms of marriage oppressing women in general, hence already shows the harm toward women in the process. Closing government extended by using abortion example as the way to express that regardless of what happened, feminist movement ought to oppose something that inherently limit women's choices in the process. There's two things that you can explain. The first one, both arguments try to prove that feminists ought to oppose something that will harm women's choices. This means closing government argument relies on the analysis that the policy will always result into coercion first. So there's a prerequisite for the philosophical analysis from closing government, which is connected into the first context analysis. Answer number two, I already explained why this cannot be credited. But the second one, on the other hand, opening government analysis relies on the likelihood of women marriage will oppress women, which has been proven in this particular case. So what does it mean is that probably some individuals feels that the context and the principle analysis are quite more direct in closing government, and probably opening government feels to be playing in a more worst case scenario or something along that line. But what need to be highlighted here is that insofar that opening government managed to explain the likelihood of such quote unquote worst case or like a very bad condition, this means that those conditions cannot be treated as only worst case scenario, but should be treated as quote unquote bell curve as well. So just because something sounds very severe and too worst case, that does not mean it does not happen. If a certain thing managed to explain the likelihood of those worst scenario happen, that means that they already proved the likelihood and shows that it probably happened in the majority of cases. So in conclusion of the second part is that the added philosophical analysis probably cannot be credited because of the coercion part. But even so, even though it's more direct and more quote unquote general in certain way, opening government likelihood analysis of marriage will oppress women already prove the principal analysis of the obligation to eventually oppose something, which is also the third part. The added parallel on abortion can also be counted to increase the importance of coercion, which more or less is equal with OG implicit principle, which is, in the end of the sentence, OG brought feminists ought to oppose things that will contribute to women stuck in marriage that they don't want to. This entails two things. The first one is about the harm that being explained earlier in terms of women stuck inside of a marriage and oppression, which means that it already shows the importance of opposing that. But the second one is also implicitly say that since most of the time women stuck in a marriage that they don't want to, that might entails into women a marriage that oppressing women or something along that line. This means that even though CG detailed and explicit on their analysis, it cannot be counted as an entirely new contribution, as still somewhat derivative or similar to what OG already brought in terms of the implicit principle of you ought to oppose something that women can stuck in if they don't want to stuck in that kind of conditions. Hence, the conclusion of the third question is basically opening government analysis is enough to prove the likelihood of the massive harm, and those massive harm cannot be directly disregarded just because it's something that quote unquote looks severe. It's something that if being proven the likelihood is already something that inherently good, should be something that being opposed. The second part, the added context is not quite direct and to some extent mismatched in terms of the analysis, hence questionable why the added context is probably more important than already existing context of coercion from opening government. Third and lastly, the philosophical analysis, probably something that cannot be entirely counted as a new argument, since it's something that implicit already being applied from opening government. Because of that, it ends the explanation for the SIA answer. Thank you so much for all judges, and best of luck for NOVED.